Stefani's talk at 1:15, so she can make her flight. So go ahead, Marie. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for including the paper. Thanks for organizing the conference. It's nice to see faces or half faces. So I presented an earlier version of this paper in the VIPM seminar series, and this is a revised version. The motivation is the following, and of course, the usual disclaimer applies. So the motivation is coming from the fact that the nature of trade agreements has been changing over time. So before the establishment of the WTO in 1995, most trade agreements were about lowering tariffs between the members, and now they include other provisions, and a very important provision that they include is the protection of intellectual property rights. And with these provisions, basically countries, especially developing countries, need to reach standards of IP protection that are similar to those in developed economies if they want to get access to export markets. And just to show you the evolution of these trade agreements, here I have compiled data for over 400 trade agreements, and these are like bilateral and regional, from the 50s to 2020. And the World Bank classified these agreements into those that do not mention any IPR protection. So these are just like agreements that are about lowering tariffs. Those that mention some IPR protection, and this is just something in the preamble, and those that contain substantial provisions. And what we see, this is this shaded area, what we see is that before 1995, like almost 80% of the agreements either didn't include any IP provisions, so they were very weak. But today we have like almost 90% of the agreements have some substantial requirements for protecting intellectual property rights. And this includes from making sure that patents are enforced, to making sure that foreign firms are paying for licensed technology. So
those are trade agreements that are being negotiated, or the ones that are already
enforced. Yeah, these are enforced. Yeah. So the question that I'm asking in the paper, or that I'm interested in understanding, is why do we see this change in the nature of trade agreements? Why do these two things go together, this reduction in tariffs and this protection of intellectual property rights? And in particular, what are the implications of these changes on innovation, growth, and welfare? And just to put it a little bit in context, if we think about what are the welfare gains of a trade liberalization, we're used to thinking of like static gains, so we have the standard ACR gains, where a trade liberalization is going to lower home trade shares, and that's going to increase welfare and productivity. But there is a growing literature now that is also looking at the dynamic effects of a trade liberalization that is coming through changes in the incentives to do research and development, innovation, et cetera, et cetera.
Can I just ask a very quick question about the picture you just showed us?
Yeah.
Is there any way to say like what fraction of these agreements are north-north versus north-south, and how that composition has changed over time as well, and whether there's some correlation between these?
I forgot to say that, but what you see here, like most of these trade agreements now are between developed and developing countries.
It's kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah, so it's mostly between north and south. And the idea here, and you'll see when I present the model and I have the quantification, is like, what is it there for developed countries? What is it there for developing countries, right? So there's also literature that has been looking at what are the welfare gains of improving intellectual property rights. And the channels that are emphasizing this literature, and also by those that defend or are against this type of agreements, is that IP reforms increase innovation in developed countries, because now they get rewarded for their efforts, but they also increase technology transfer to developing economies, and that's going to increase growth, that's going to increase welfare. But the negative effect is that that's also giving more monopoly power to the innovators, as developing countries now need to pay for technology that maybe they were getting for free before, they were innovating. So what the question that I want to answer in this paper is, how do these IPR reforms are interacting with the traditional gains from trade liberalization? And what you're going to see that it's going to be very important is how do these reforms in IP are going to interact with the dynamic effects of a trade liberalization. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to build a model of trade. It's going to be very simple. It's going to be an Armington model of trade where there is an expansion of varieties. You could also do this with other types of trade models, like what it was showing yesterday. You can think of like a quality ladder model, and you're going to get very similar results. In the model, the channel of diffusion is going to be technology licensing. So what we're going to have is it's going to be some innovators that are going to invest to do R&D. And then in a foreign country, there's going to be adopters that will want to use those innovations to produce a good, and they will have to pay royalties if they want to produce the good and with that technology. And I'm going to allow for imperfect enforcement of intellectual property rights. So you can think that some of this adoption happens through imitation, so they don't pay any royalties, and part of that adoption happens through licensing. And the interaction with trade is that normally countries, developed countries, have mechanisms in place that can basically restrict exports from countries that are producing with stolen technology. Okay? So that's where the interaction between trade and intellectual property rights is going to happen in the model. And I'm not going to show data motivating this, but it's in the paper. But something that I show, and this is the reason why I'm focusing on technology licensing, there could be other ways in which diffusion happens, is that countries that sign RTAs with IP provisions experience an increase in technology licensing following enforcement of the trade agreement. And you see that in those countries, and when you control for those countries that do not sign RTAs with IP provisions, so they just sign RTAs that are about lowering tariffs, you don't see anything happening with licensing. So what that means is that those countries, especially developing countries, either start paying royalties that they were not paying before, or they also receive more technology and you do see more payments of royalties there. Okay, so the model is going to be tractable for quantification. So this is going to be I'm going to do a quantitative model. I'm going to calibrate it to data on royalties, innovation, and trade. And I'm going to look at the transitional dynamics of the model, because what you're going to see is that there are interesting results when you compare the short run versus the long run of these policies. So this is going to allow me to capture the dynamic effects of these two policies, and I'm going to evaluate how these gains are happening along the transition. Okay, so just to give you a preview of the results in case I don't get to everything. So this is what I'm going to get. How do IPR reforms impact the gains from a trade liberalization? In a model that I'm going to quantify to 3 countries, what I'm going to see is that everybody's going to experience positive welfare gains from these policies. And one of the reasons is that there's going to be static effects and dynamic effects. So here the dynamic effects are going to dominate, and we're going to see that these policies are going to generate higher innovation incentives and higher growth. But there's going to be very large differences in how these gains happen along the transition. So developing countries, they are going to experience short-term losses because now they have to pay for these royalties, but they are going to experience long-term losses because now growth is higher. And in developed economies, what we're going to see is that there's short-term gains. Now, what will happen if we only have a trade liberalization, but we don't have reform on intellectual property rights? So we lower tariffs of products that are coming from China, even though those products can be produced with imitated technology. What we're going to see here is that we're going to have short-term gains that are coming from the standard ACR forces. We're going to have some dynamic gains that are coming because now the market is higher and innovation increases, but there's going to be also big dynamic losses that are coming because there is a lower incentive of doing R&D by developed countries that now they are getting their market flooded by all these products that they are generating more competition and they are produced with imitated technology. Okay, so it's very important, this interaction between trade liberalization and imperfect IPR. Now, what would happen if we do an IPR reform, but we don't do any trade liberalization? What we see here is that there's very big short-term losses in the developing countries that are doing the IPR reform. So that's not very surprising. So what I get from here is that a trade liberalization with type of trade and IP reforms. Okay, so
if they do a IPR reform, like a development, they can't change their mind later once we get a bunch of innovations coming in and we just imitate.
No, so here, if you do an IPR reform, you're just going to start paying royalties for the stuff that is coming from other countries, and that's going to stay like that. Yeah.
So can you, so one more question on that one, third bullet point. So you're saying Is it predetermined that the developing countries will be worse off, or you're just saying that's this possibility that,
This is a possibility, and in the end, it will be like a quantitative question. Yeah.
because you say it dominates, I guess I was.
Well,
Sorry,
no,
what
so
was-
here, so in the quantification that I'm doing in the third bullet point, you mean?
No, I mean, that statement, developing countries' short-term losses as they need to be more royalties
Yeah.
dominates. The short-term losses
Yeah.
dominate the positive trade. effect.
So,
I guess that seemed kind
Oh,
of
wait,
definitively
okay, so-
negative, and I wasn't sure.
yeah, no, okay, so like overall, everybody gains when you do
Okay.
the two, but you have like short-term losses that are coming because you have to pay royalties,
Oh, I
even though
see.
you can export these goods to
Okay,
other countries.
so that was a statement about in the short run,
Yeah,
not saying that.
not overall. Yeah, overall, everybody gains, which for me was the surprising finding. When I think of it,
Sorry, one more question, sorry.
Yeah.
So do you think this is like why, in terms of like how these things are actually negotiated, is this trade-off like something that is like mentioned? It's like, well, we know that developing countries are gonna be
no,
hurt by IPO. Okay.
no, the only thing that is mentioned is that this is gonna be good for developing countries because they are gonna have access to technology that they didn't have before. And what I'm trying to show is that there's something else, right? That is not capturing these negotiations, and that has to do with the dynamic gains that are coming from these incentives to do innovation.
I guess the way I was thinking about it, why I said that they couldn't change their mind, is like in developing countries, like say implement some IPR, right? So
Mhm.
I imagine, corruption or whatever, but it's hard to enforce it. So how do they, do we have actual examples of successful IPR, right? Like you could write on paper and say, okay, here's an IPR. But people just don't abide by it, right? So,
Right, no, so I don't have good examples, and that's a good point. I should look into that. But I mean, if you think about, and that's the implication that I'm gonna have the trade war, or now that I'm at the Fed, the trade tensions between China and the US, they are a lot about IP protection and misappropriation of intellectual property rights. And the US has all these mechanisms in place, and I have a slide, maybe I can show it to you later, that can actually enforce this IPR protection, like it can establish tariffs, right? And there is this section, or I forgot the name of the section, maybe it's like 337 or something else, where basically they are lowering tariffs to developing countries, to exports that are coming from developing countries, if they actually enforce this intellectual property protection, right? Now, the exact way in which they are doing it, I don't know. Okay, so let me lay out the model. This is an Hamilton model of trade. There's going to be M countries indexed by IMN. Time is discrete and indexed by T. There's only labor as a factor of production that is going to be mobile within countries, but immobile across countries. There's going to be trading intermediate goods and monopolistic competition. And the dynamics are coming through endogenous productivity, and productivity evolves through innovation. And innovation here means that there's more varieties arriving into the economy. There's also going to be adopters that are going to invest resources to use a foreign technology for production. And the innovators are going to receive royalties from the adopters, and I'm going to allow for this imperfect IPR. So the innovation and diffusion part of the model is like this Eaton and Kortum papers of the mid-90s, but with the difference that there is endogenous adoption. Okay? So adoption is not going to be exogenous. Adopters are going to invest resources to be able to use a technology in the production of a good. So references, there's a representative consumer that is going to choose consumption to maximize utility, and the consumer is going to get labor income, it's going to get the profits of all the firms in the economy, and then it's going to lend to the innovators and to the adopters. And this is all the static part of the model. There's in the production side, there's a final producer that is going to use traded goods, J, to produce a good with a CS production function. So sigma is the elasticity of substitution across varieties. This X here is the amount of variety J that country I exports to country N. And the amount of goods that are used in the final production is TIT. So TIT is the number of varieties that have been produced in country I. These intermediate goods are produced by monopolistic competitive firms that basically use labor. And this omega n is the fundamental productivity of the country. So here firms are all going to face the same productivity, and the productivity that all the firms face is heterogeneous across countries. Okay. So there's ISO transport cost to ship goods from country A to country I, and this is this T, and that implies that if we want to ship or if we want to sell X units of the goods from country A to country I, we actually have to produce T times X. And the firms are going to choose a price that is a constant markup over the marginal cost, and the markup is given by this elasticity of substitution. So in this model, the import share, so this is the share of goods from country I that country N is buying, has this expression. So basically it depends on the productivity of country I, the exporter, and the productivity of the exporter is going to have two components. One is this fundamental productivity omega, and the other is this TIT, which is the number of goods that are used for final production. And what is different here versus the static models of trade is that I'm going to allow this T to evolve over time. So there's going to be entry of new varieties, and that's what is going to drive endogenous productivity. Okay. So how does that happen? That's going to happen through two processes. One is yes.
So as you said, like this intellectual property may affect the competition in the market, right? So isn't that interesting to like also study how this affects like the market and also the competition in the market, and also the markups that these firms basically can charge, rather than like having a constant markup?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting angle. That's I'm not gonna have anything to say about that, but that's definitely a very, yeah. So now here you just have monopolistic competitive firms. One alternative, if you have a quality ladder model, is you just have head-to-head competition. So you have per-trunk competition. And in that sense, you have like variable markups. Okay, so now the question is, how do these varieties evolve over time? So we have two processes. So we can introduce new varieties through innovation or through adoption of foreign varieties. So what this means is that in a country, we're going to see that firms are producing a certain amount of varieties, and some of these varieties are produced with domestic technology, and some of these varieties are going to be produced with foreign technology. And I'm going to call A and I the number of varieties that country N produces that are used with technologies that have been developed by country I. So at each time T, we're going to have domestic varieties and foreign varieties. This is just varieties that are produced in the country, but with foreign technology. So there's endogenous innovation. The way I'm modeling it is like in Int'l Cortum 96, where an innovator in country N is going to invest final output to introduce new ideas. So think of an idea as a blueprint to produce a new intermediate good. And the number of new goods or new ideas that are going to arrive at country N at time T is given by this expression here. So it depends on what is the R&D investment in the country. There's diminishing returns of doing R&D, and then it depends on the productivity of or the efficiency of innovation that depends on two terms. One is a country-specific parameter lambda, so you can think of this as innovation policy in the country. And T this is like an externality, right? You are learning from stuff that you have already available in the country. Okay. And then the innovators have a monopoly over their idea, and this is their profit. So basically, they are getting the value of an innovation, and then how many new technologies we have in the country, and then they are paying the cost that is paid in terms of the final good. So basically, they are paying this price PNT. Okay, and I will show you later what is or how can we get this value of an innovation. So the other process by which technologies can grow in the country is through endogenous adoption. So here the idea is that,
just to be clear, so you come up with like an idea, and all ideas are basically the same when you come up with them. It's just a matter of some ideas get adopted faster than other ideas,
yes,
and then that's when your kind of profit stream gets killed.
right.
But it's not like there's no other sources of heterogeneity in terms of across the firms. It's just really whether or not the stuff got stolen.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, you can think of a quality ladder model where you add this additional margin, right? So you can have good ideas, bad ideas, and then you have a probability that these ideas get adopted and produced as an intermediate good.
I'm getting confused by the Z versus the capital T
Oh, yeah. So think of this. So T, okay, so T is this thing here, right?
Yeah, formed with the A's, okay,
Yeah,
good, good.
too much notation. But you can think that if there was instantaneous diffusion or adoption within the country, the ANN would be equal to the ZN. Basically, you have this new idea set and or this stock of ideas set and T that immediately get adopted. So they
Yeah,
become
okay.
ANN, and then you just like use them forward.
A would be like Z, okay.
Yes.
And so how is A different than Z in reality, in the model?
Right. So later on, I'm going to assume that there's instantaneous diffusion within the country. So then ANN is ZN.
Oh, it is gonna become the same,
Yes.
okay.
It's going to become the same. But the reason why I have all this notation is because this is a new assumption. But then you can think of Tn as Zn, and then this ANI is going to be a fraction of Zi.
Yeah.
So
Right,
out of the
right, okay.
technologies
Yeah,
that
yeah.
are produced in country, how many are adopted?
It looks like there's no like creative destruction in the model because you cannot innovate and then like reduce the imports. So all the like all creative destruction in the data would look like imitation, like stealing the idea from your model.
The only difference here is that when you adopt a technology, you're going to produce a completely different good. So because there is
The model has to.
yes.
Right?
Yeah, and again, if you have like this quality ladder model, then you can have this other dimension. So, okay, so now adoption, I'm going to assume that it's endogenous, so it's costly and it takes time. So basically, what happens here is that adopters in country I are going to invest final output in this amount to adopt new technologies that have been developed in country N. And they are going to adopt it with a probability that depends on, that has this functional form. So it depends on the investment into adoption. Okay, there's diminishing returns to adoption. And then it depends on these country per specific parameters. So this is basically reflecting what is the likelihood that two countries start engaging into this diffusion of technologies. And the law of motion of new technologies that have been adopted by country A from country N takes this form. So at each point in time, we're adopting a fraction of the technologies that were not adopted before. Okay? So new technologies arrive, and then an adopter can invest resources to adopt this technology today, but it may be unsuccessful, and then it can keep adopting, investing resources to adopt the technology at some point in the future. Okay, so now, where is this licensing happening? When an adopter gets the technology and is successful and starts using that technology to produce a good, then that adopter is going to pay royalties to the innovators. And what I'm going to assume here is that royalties are paid as a fraction of the profits that are made by intermediate producers. So at each point in time, country I is going to pay royalties to country N that are going to be a fraction of the profits that country I is making that have been produced, that is making with technologies that are coming from country N. And that fraction is going to be this psi N. Okay, and here is when I'm going to introduce this imperfect enforcement of intellectual property rights. So if psi is equal to 0, if they are not paying any royalties, they are getting the technology, they don't pay royalties, everything happens through imitation. If psi is positive, and we will see what good enforcement of IPR is, then they are going to pay a fraction of the profits, and that's, then we have like enforcement of intellectual property rights. So in the end, the total stock of ideas that are available for production in country I is equal to this sum. So we have ideas that are coming from each country N, okay, that have been adopted, and then we're paying royalties for them.
And the idea is like that side can be very costlessly.
Yes.
There's no like
Small.
monitoring technology or court systems that you have to kind of create to.
Right.
So it's just.
Here I'm going to assume that it's taken as given. And one thing that you could do is endogenize this guy, and that's something that I'm working on now. So you can think, one way in which the literature endogenizes this side is assuming that there is a surplus function that you're splitting between the innovator and the adopter. Yeah. Okay? Because here this side is creating this tension between the value of an innovation and the value of an adoption. The adopters pay a fraction of the profits to the innovators, and then they get the rest, right?
Sure.
So there's, yeah, but there's nothing else here.
Yeah, it just seems like
Besides.
easy to kind of adjust, but in reality, you have to kind of do something to build up credibility or.
Yeah.
Because you can write the laws, but.
Yeah, right.
So with no IPR, the psi equals 0, right? Or no?
Sorry,
If you don't have an IPR agreement,
it's equal
then
to
the
0.
psi is 0.
Yeah, so you don't pay anything. Or you could think, and this is what I'm gonna do in the quantification, and this is something that I'm still struggling with, which is what is the value of the psi that is gonna make innovators and adopters happy if I'm not doing this surplus
Yeah.
thing. So I'm just like assuming that, psi is like a certain number based on what the data, right? What is the fraction of profits that are typically paid in royalties? And then what I'm saying is that if they are paying less than that, there's imperfect enforcement of intellectual property rights. Yeah, that's when I put quantification. Okay, so what is the value of an innovation? So the
I
value,
guess wouldn't there be something where that maybe with the IPR agreement, you actually, the developed countries more sort of willing to share the technology and kind of help out on the adoption process? Because they may not even be particular, they might even promote it. Versus if the psi is 0, they're also going to want to just like not let anybody see it.
Yeah.
That would tend to be a force that would make the IPR more beneficial to the developing.
yeah,
It kind of reminds me of, I might have mentioned that when you did the VTM thing, but some of the old papers by Mansfield are kind of nice about that. He did some surveys of firms and like, are you willing to share your technology with
Right.
the developing country based on
right.
they do it?
Yeah.
It would make a lot of sense for the adoption cost.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was gonna say.
If you're not paying any royalties, it's very hard to adopt because you just have
Yeah.
to like pay, you've got to hire somebody to just copy them.
Yeah, no, that's exactly. So when I started modeling this stuff, the question was like, how can I have this mechanism, right? Like now, innovators are not going to be willing to share their technology if they know that the technology can be imitated. So one way in which I started thinking about it, and I think maybe Mansfield is the one who has, oh no, I think it's Hellman in 91. He does it in this way. So what he does is that the cost of adoption is higher if there's imperfect enforcement of IPR versus now you are paying a lower fraction of your revenue. But that's another way in which this can be modeled. Yeah. Okay. So what is so here there's going to be again some notation, but so when a country or when an adopter is adopting a technology, it's gonna and is successful and is using the technology to produce goods, it's gonna get profits, right? So a fraction of those profits is going to be paid out to the innovators. So the value of an adopted technology for the innovator is just the present discounted value of the profits that the adopter is going to get using those technologies, and that fraction is coming from psi. Okay. Then what is the value of a technology that has not been adopted yet? So the innovator is going to get tomorrow with probability epsilon, that depends on the investment into adoption, is going to get these B's, it's going to get profits forever. With probability 1 minus epsilon, we're going back to J. Okay. So in the end, what this tells us is that the value of an innovation is the present discounted value of all the profits that are going to be made by the intermediate producers that are successful at adopting the technology. So we're taking into account this probability of adoption epsilon, okay? And that's what this value of an innovation in country N is. And the first condition for the optimal investment into R&D depends on the value of the innovation and also the cost of investing into R&D. Okay, how about the adopter? So the adopter is just going to be the flip side of this problem. The value of an adopted technology for the adopter is going to be 1 minus psi of the profit that is making from technologies that are coming from country N. And the value of a non-adopted technology yet for the adopter is given by this expression here. So today it's investing resources into adoption. Tomorrow with probability epsilon, it will be successful, it will adopt the technology and then it will get this. And with probability 1 minus epsilon, it will not be able to adopt the technology and then it can keep trying to invest resources to adopt the technology. Okay, and this is the first order condition for adoption. So basically, it depends on the probability of adoption, and it depends on the difference between the value of an adopted technology and the value of a non-adopted technology. Okay.
There must be somehow, I guess, by re-entry, I would have thought it would be zero. Like if you didn't successfully adopt it, well, then you got nothing. It's sort of like as a, you know, if you're a graduate student and you think about an idea and you don't think of anything, well, you got nothing. It's not like you have
like
some
you can keep
value,
thinking and then maybe, yeah, you can keep investing and trying to get a new idea, and maybe in the, like tomorrow you get something.
Yeah, but why? Yeah, so why aren't you just starting with a clean slate each time when you fail? You're just starting from scratch again. I don't quite understand this. It sounds kind of like you've zeroed in on a certain thing in this foreign country and you're the only one and you didn't get it, but you're still somehow have property rights. To be the
Right, but so this is capturing the fact that, so you have this technology that you want to adopt today, and you may not adopt it today, but you may want to keep trying, right, to adopt the same technology in the future.
Yeah, but why couldn't somebody else come in? So then I don't see how it has any value. If you didn't come up with it, what is the kind of capital or asset you built up by having tried and failed? Why should that have value? I guess. Because anybody else could come in there and do the same thing as you.
Are the decisions made by individuals or the country?
So these are like, you can think of this as a continuum of firms that are trying to adopt technologies that have been developed somewhere else. And they are investing in these resources, and some will be lucky and will be able to adopt it today.
Yeah.
And some will be, so maybe that's the way to think about it. Some will be lucky tomorrow, like they keep investing these resources, and then some will be lucky tomorrow.
But somehow I still feel like there'd be a kind of re-entry that would make it.
Yeah, like in the Romer model, right?
Yeah.
There's a free entry and then
Yeah, which might actually simplify your.
JINT.
I somehow feel like you might have something slightly simpler if you did that, and with the same flavor of what you're doing.
Similar to the innovation process, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, let me think about it.
It definitely feels like the JINT should be zero. And that's just a free entry decision.
Right. I see. Okay. Okay, and then we can close the model. So final output is used for consumption, R&D, and adoption. There's the labor market clearing condition, and then there's the balance of payments equation. So here what we have is that there's trading goods, that are these trading intermediate goods, but we also have these royalty payments, right? So you can think of this as a trading services. Okay, so the model has a balanced growth path where all the countries are gonna grow at the same rate, and that's what diffusion guarantees. There's gonna be a common and constant growth rate of the stock of knowledge that I'm gonna call G, but countries are gonna differ in the levels of productivity. And all the variables are gonna be normalized so that they are constant on the balanced growth path when I compute the transitional dynamics. And something that we can do, and this is very nice, this is something that I actually learned with these papers of Fitton and Gordon in the 90s, is that there's a very nice way to characterize the growth rate and the level of productivity in these models. So you can express you can get an expression for the growth rate of productivity on the balanced growth path that takes this form. And basically what you can do is you can express the right-hand side of this expression in a matrix form that depends on the epsilons, that depends on the lambdas, and that depends on the R&D intensity, and of course the beta. And that you can use something called the Frobenius theorem, where you can actually get the maximum eigenvalue of that matrix. Maximum real eigenvalue is going to be the G, and the eigenvector associated to a scalar. And so here what you have to do is you have to choose one country as a numerator, and you just get the T relative to the T in that country. Okay? So this is very neat. And in a recent paper, I developed an algorithm that basically allows, because here is assuming that for a given R&D intensity, for a given epsilon, for a given lambda, you get this G and this T. But this is going to be endogenous to the model, right? So we have developed an algorithm where we can actually back out this G and this T, and you allow this to be endogenous. Okay, so changes in trade costs, the fees, and changes in the IPR enforcement, the SI, are going to have an effect on the growth rates and the level of productivity on the balance cost path through changes in R&D intensity and through changes in the probability of adoption. Okay, so that's where on the balance cost path, these things are going to move through changes in the SI and through changes in the trade cost. Okay, so let me go into the quantitative analysis, and that's going to allow us to understand a little more how the model works. Here I'm going to consider a 3-country model. So I'm going to look at the US, China, and an aggregate rest of the world. And what I want to look at, the experiment that I'm going to engineer, is what are the implications of improving intellectual property rights in China to get access to US export markets. Okay, so right now, the US and China do not have any regional trade agreement with IP provisions in place. But as I was mentioning at the beginning, first of all, recent trade policy in the US has been centered around these accusations of technology leakages and all that. And second, the US has this mechanism where it can place restrictions to imports that are coming from developing countries that are not satisfying this intellectual property protection. Okay? And then I'm going to evaluate the short and the long run effects on innovation, growth, and development. So I'm gonna, the way I'm gonna do this is I'm gonna calibrate the initial balance growth path to the 2000s, okay? And I'm gonna use data for trade, royalties, and R&D. And this may be subject to the criticism that George made like the first day, where I'm assuming that China is on the balance growth path. And I'm going to set the trade productivity and trade cost using the standard gravity techniques. I'm going to calibrate the parameters of diffusion. So one feature of this model is that the probability of diffusion is going to be constant on the balance growth path. So I'm going to calibrate the epsilon using an approach that I developed in another paper, where I compute a gravity equation of royalty payments on a bunch of fixed effects. And one is a country per fixed effect. So I'm going to get these epsilons from this country per fixed effect. And then I'm going to calibrate the parameters of innovation. So the parameter of diminishing returns to R&D, the efficiency of innovation using this algorithm that I was talking about with the growth rate on the balance cost path and the Frobenius theorem. Okay. And then I don't have a good way to pin down this beta A, this diminishing returns to adoption, because there are no good data on adoption that I can use. I'm just going to assume that it's equal to the diminishing returns to R&D. Okay, and here are some numbers. So the data that I get are like 0.52, and this is consistent with some papers in the literature. So Andres Rodriguez-Clare has some papers about that. Then what I'm assuming here is that there is instantaneous diffusion within the country. That's what I was mentioning at the beginning. And what I'm going to assume, so here is where I'm still working on. So what is a good way to measure these stats? Okay. So what I'm going to assume for this particular exercise is that within the country, innovators and adopters are going to get 50% of the profits, right? So they are going to do 50-50. I don't have a better way to right now to calibrate this parameter. And then across countries, what I'm going to assume is that adopters pay 25% of the profits that they make. So there are no good data of, at least not that I can find, on royalty payments across countries. What is the fraction of profits that they are paying, right? And some royalties are paid as a fraction of profits, some royalties are paid as a lump sum. But like there are some reports by McKinsey that suggest that it's like 25%. There is a thing that is called the 25% rule, right? So I'm going to assume that they pay 25%, and then what is imperfect enforcement of IPR? Well, so China is going to pay half of that. Okay, so that's the best I can do right now.
Maria,
Yes.
I guess this gave me a thought about the structure of your model, because you had the XIII. So it's sort of like you're separating innovation and production or something like that. It's kind of like that these people in their garages come up with ideas, and then they somehow they make a 50-50 deal, and then
Right.
some big firm takes it over and then produces with it, right?
Right. Yeah.
So then a question comes up, if you're a developing country with no IPR, if you really took that literally, then even within the country, they wouldn't want to adopt because they'd be worried about being ripped off by somebody else in their same country.
Yes, that's true.
Because you're kind of saying once you adopt something, you have perfect property rights over
Right.
somebody else not coming in and
Right,
because you have the monopolistic competition set up.
within the country.
Which I think, yeah, which makes sense, but still, that is kind of maybe a reason why a developing country might see that promoting this kind of adopting developed country stuff is good, and therefore they want to provide property rights to their own firms, and
Yeah.
then in the process, they're kind of not so opposed to.
Right, so actually that's gonna be in this exercise, because what I'm gonna assume is that this psi is 0.5, except for psi in China, which is half of that. So when I do the exercise of an improvement of intellectual property rights, it's gonna mean that you don't only do reforms to pay property rights for foreign technology, but on the way, you're also doing domestic reforms.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you see that is happening in China. Yeah. Okay, so the implementation is the following. China is going to improve IPR. So what that means is that it's going to start paying 25%, and inside China is going to pay 50%. And that implies that royalties are going to increase by 95%, okay, between the two balance of funds. And R&D intensity, because we are also starting to pay to the domestic innovators, is going to increase by 60%. And that's going to be joined with a liberalization of Chinese exports to the US. And here the export share is going to go from 5% to 13%. Okay? So I'm going to compute the perfect foresight solution of the models. I'm going to assume that this policy is unanticipated and it's permanent and it's a one-time shock. And then I'm going to see what happens with innovation, growth, and welfare. And I'm going to do I'm gonna do two exercises where I'm gonna try to disentangle these two channels, the trade liberalization with the intellectual property rights, and I'm gonna see how the two connect. Okay, so let me go through the, until what time do I have? 12:15?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me go through the main channels. What is gonna happen here is the following. So now China is gonna improve intellectual property rights protection, both domestic and foreign. So what that means is that innovators in China are gonna get more, are gonna start getting royalties, and also foreign innovators are gonna get more royalties, okay? So innovation is gonna increase, both domestic and foreign, right? So now the US gets rewarded, the innovators in the US get rewarded, innovators in China get rewarded. So that's gonna increase R&D intensity. But what happens with adoption in China? So now adopters have to pay more royalties, right? So this is gonna be a negative effect. But there's going to be a positive effect because now they have like a larger market. They can export these goods to the US. So that's going to increase their expected profits. So that's basically going to incentivize more adoption. Right? The net effect in China is going to be a decline in the adoption intensity. So if I just show you this, we're going to have this tension in China where the adoption intensity is going to decline and it's going to be permanently lower. But the R&D in China is going to increase and it's going to be higher. And here you may think that there's going to be very interesting dynamics, but actually what you see is like a very high increase at the beginning of R&D intensity. And when you look at what happens afterwards, you see that it takes some time to get to the balance of path. Okay, so there is this tension between adoption and R&D intensity in China. The balance of path is going to be higher because there's higher innovation, there's also higher adoption. And then there's going to be like a static effect, right? The standard static ACR effect, where the US now gets all these foreign varieties, and that's going to decrease its country share. And there's going to be a positive impact in China because now it has access to these export markets, right? And it has an improvement in its terms of trade. So what happens with welfare? So I'm going to compute welfare as measuring consumption equivalent units. So I'm going to look at what is the how much consumption consumers are willing to give up every period to be indifferent between staying in the balanced growth path, in the initial balanced growth path forever, or just like going to an equilibrium in which there is perfect enforcement of IPR and lower trade.
So just to be clear, this is basically like you're trying to quantify the impact of these two policy changes between the US and China, or China and the rest of the world.
US and China, yeah.
Yeah. And so it makes a difference in these numbers, whether we think about D as actually like technology or trade policy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
You know, for the big thing of what happened from 2000 and 2012, it was actually not technology, it was policy. It was
Studies
basically-
and, yeah,
Most of it was, I mean, the big chunk of it was actually just the ATC. These guys got access to the ATC, the textile stuff.
Yeah.
So you removed all these quotas and it kind of phased that
Right.
way. And that's sort of like generated all that growth. So this is going to kind of substantially overstate.
Yeah,
the
because
benefits.
everything is gonna come through a decrease in the transport costs. That includes
Yeah,
both
instead of just like
policy and-
reducing policy. So, yeah, if you did it with tariffs, it would be useful to do it with tariffs. And then again, it would also be useful to do it like with the phased in, because the ATC things were all
Yeah,
kind of staggered, right?
Yeah. yeah,
yeah.
yeah, no, yeah. that's
And I
true.
guess the last comment I'd just make is like some of that growth in China's exports was really just about like a big demand shock for kind of certain kinds of technological goods that China was better producing, and not really like a trade cost shock. If we think about,
No
like,
tariffs,
yeah,
yeah,
it was just like, you know, Apple figured out a way to produce something that was amazing that
right,
everyone else started producing, that it was cheapest to produce in
Right.
China, and the world demand shifted to that. So just in terms of if you're really thinking about this as that
the
experiment,
quantitative, yeah, no, no, that's a very good point, and it's true, because now what I'm doing is I'm just like calibrating the trade costs to whatever they were in 2012, right? So it's like all this decrease in trade costs is coming in my country, not through policy, right?
Yeah.
So this is, yeah, that's right, yeah, that's true. Okay, so where are the welfare effects? And this is what I was saying at the beginning, everybody gains, right? So the US gains more, the China is the one that gains the least, right? So this is not that interesting. What is interesting is to see how this happens over time, right? So what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna look at the path of consumption. And the way I'm gonna plot it is, I'm gonna start from the initial balance of path. So this is like consumption in the initial balance of path. This is deviations from the initial balance of path, right? So this is 0. And then here, what we have is the shock, right? We have this reform. And then what happens in the US, there is a big jump in consumption. And now we get into a new balance growth path where the growth rate is higher, right? So that's where you see this thing here. So the US is always gaining, and we know that overall it gains, right? Because it's static, like short-term gains, and then the dynamic gains in the long run. But what happens with China? And what we see here is that again, in the initial balance of path, we're here, the shock comes, there are short-term losses, right? That are not like that big, that they just last for a few periods, and then they get immediately into a new balance growth path, okay? So now the question, so what we see is like large differences in how these like welfare gains are happening in these two countries. So the question is that how do these two things are interacting together? To be able to answer that question, I'm just gonna assume that we're in a reform in which one is not, like one of the reforms is not there. So let's start with a reform in which we only have like improvements in IP protection, and there's no trade liberalization, okay? And here are the welfare gains. So what we see is that, again, everybody gains, but look at China. I mean, the gain is much, much lower than if you also have the trade liberalization on top of that. So what happens along the transition? This is for the US, this is for China. So the US, what we see is that at the moment of the reform, there is an increase in consumption, initial increase, and then we get to a new balance growth path where the growth rate is higher. What happens in China? Again, we have a short-term loss, but it takes much longer to get into a positive gain than with a liberalization in which you also have reductions in trade costs, okay? So again, China losses, and it loses much more in the short run than if you also have the trade liberalization. But now what I think it was very interesting of all these results that I have is that what happens if you only have the trade liberalization, but there's no IP reform, okay? So what this means is that now China can export goods that may be produced with imitated technology back to the US. So what you see is that the gains from trade are lower, right? They are low in the US. The rest of the world actually loses. So there may be some trade diversion here that still need to extrapolate more. And China gains, right, from this trade liberalization. So why is that? So what we see is the following. Here I have the 3 reforms. So the solid blue line is like the baseline where the two are improved. This red line is what I showed you before, what happens if you improve IP protection, but you don't liberalize trade. And this dashed line here, This is what happens if you liberalize trade, but you don't improve IPR. What happens in the US? So you have an initial increase in consumption, right? So you have initial or short-term gains, but then you're gonna start getting losses. What happens in China? You have again like short-term gains, but then you're gonna start having losses. So why is that? What happens here? So here what this tells you is that there's like a wedge of distortion in the model that is coming from this imperfect enforcement of IPR that seems to be amplified by this trade liberalization. So the trade liberalization makes this distortion worse. And why is that? That happens because now the US is going to start getting all these products from China that are produced with imitated technology. So the innovators in the US are not getting any profits from that technology, but now they are facing more competition, right? So the profit per firm now is going to be lower. So with a trade liberalization in a world in which there is imperfect enforcement of intellectual property rights, the growth rate in the balanced growth path is lower. Okay? Because basically what this trade liberalization is generating less incentives for innovators to do R&D because now they are getting flooded by this imitated technology. So what you see is that if you don't have improvements of intellectual property rights, countries in the long run are going to end up losing, right? So this decreases in.
Lisa, sorry, I'm really interpreting that picture. And then it keeps getting worse and worse through time?
Yes.
Like, you go to zero? How do I interpret this picture with the downward sloping line?
So you are always going to be below the growth rate of the balance growth path.
These are growth rates. Sorry. Okay,
Yes,
okay,
yeah. This is all relative to the initial balance growth path. So in the end, so what happens here? So okay, so look at this picture here, for example. So what happens here is that you have an initial increase in consumption, and then you're going to
increase in consumption and increase in the consumption growth rate.
This
I'm
is
just
the
getting
log of
confused about it.
consumption relative to the log of consumption in the initial balance growth path.
So it's like the percent change above the, okay.
Yeah. So here, the slope tells you that the growth rate is going to be higher. Actually, it's going to be even higher if you just have IP protection.
So with the first one, the balanced growth path, the growth rate must permanently increase, right, in the first one. And so
Yes.
you're diverging from the growth path you used to be on.
Yes, and the same here.
But that one, does it,
It's the same
oh,
thing
I
here.
see, because it's lower, so you
It's going
just
to be
keep.
permanently lower. So
Right.
you're going to get to a final balance growth path where it's going to be a lower growth
Lower
rate.
growth rate.
That is coming.
And this
because-
is this world where we all stop doing R&D because we know if we do it, then China will just rip us off and export it back to us. So
we're just getting all this
So we're
competition and we're
just-
not getting anything from.
yeah, so we become a less innovative world.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And this is just an extreme case, but it's just telling you that this improvement of intellectual property rights is like giving the right incentives, right? Because trade is just like, so.
It would be neat to see, because this is the opposite. I kind of feel like yours is more plausible, but there is that Heltman paper in Econometric or something that kind of, doesn't it say the opposite? And it's some weird thing about like it's something like all the imports from China free up labor. So all the stuff Otter Gordon and Hansen talk about, all those people become R&D workers and
Yeah.
the world becomes more innovative and grows faster, something like that. That's kind of the mechanism. So I don't find it very plausible, but it is.
Yeah.
It might be worth kind of contrasting. It might make your paper look better because it seems more plausible.
Yeah,
either
this
way
is
of
a
thinking
90s
about it.
paper, yeah. Mhm. Okay, so let me conclude here. And this is what I was saying. The way I'm looking at this now is the way I introduce this imperfect enforcement of intellectual property rights is it's like a tax or a wedge between innovators and adopters. And if we just think about the liberalization in this world, and we just account for these dynamic effects, we know that this is gonna, in a world where there's perfect enforcement of IPR, it will increase innovation and it will increase adoption through market size, right? Because now we have access to export markets. But with imperfect enforcement of IPR, it's like trade is making the distortion larger, and it's going to generate dynamic losses through lower growth rates, right? So in a way, this improvement of intellectual property rights in these trade agreements are making sure that the incentives are correctly aligned and everybody starts gaining, right? And as I showed you before, the gains are larger if there is a regularization on top of the IPR improvement. So I'm gonna stop here.
Final comments? Okay, thanks, Andrea.